and kick things off. Firstly, I'd like to welcome everyone to this, this edition of our CEBRAnar series, the CEBRA webinars. I know they've become a bit of a, they have a reputation for being a productive, interesting use of people's time, and we usually get really positive feedback from those that attend. So to those of you that have made the time to come along today, I thank you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sam Wells. I'm the new Principal Director of the Innovation Research and Education Branch in Biosecurity Strategy and Reform Division. Before I get going, I want to start today's session by acknowledging the original custodians of the land from which we're all meeting. For me, that's the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra, along with the Ngambri family, and recognise their ongoing contribution to people, place and culture. Also extend that recognition to the traditional owners of lands from which everybody else is meeting from today in this diverse and beautiful country of ours. And if you're so inclined, I encourage you to put the name of your original custodians in the chat for today, so we can get to know the geographical spread and the diversity of people across the land. No obligation, only if you wish to do so. Before we get going, please, I'd like to please ask everyone to ensure your microphones are on mute and that you can leave your cameras on or off according to your preference. The CEBRAnar will be recorded today for people who aren't able to attend. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentations, and you can either use the hands up function in the presentation or include them in the comments and chat, and we'll try and get through as many as possible with whatever time we have available. For the newcomers, the Centre of Excellence in Biosecurity Risk Analysis, CEBRA, is a long-standing biosecurity research initiative, and it plays a really important role in providing Australia and New Zealand with expert biosecurity risk analysis and advice, and it helps us inform a range of biosecurity risk management activities that we undertake. We have over many years built a really wonderful and productive relationship with CEBRA, and running these CEBRAnars is a great way of promoting and advertising the great work that we do through that partnership model. Today, we're joined by my old friend, Professor Tom Kompas, Dr. Edith, Arndt and Dr. Tracey Hollings to present on the topic, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research Contribution to Biosecurity in Australia and Overseas. So I'll quickly touch on our three presenters today, and then I'll stop talking because we're not here to listen to me after all. But to introduce you to the three, Professor Tom Kompas is a professor in environmental economics and biosecurity at the University of Melbourne and a chief investigator at CEBRA. His work includes large dimensional computational economic models on climate change and biosecurity. Dr. Edith Arndt is an alpine ecologist and research fellow at CEBRA, and her prior projects have included the development of an evaluation framework for Australia's national biosecurity system and the examination of factors influencing marine vessel biofouling. And Dr. Tracey Hollings is a senior research fellow at CEBRA. She has a PhD in zoology from the University of Tasmania. Let me check my notes there. Yes, University of Tasmania, and a background in ecological modelling. So with that being said, I'll take pause, a drink of water, and I'll pass over to our presenters for today's presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Sam. I'm going to start off for the team. And indeed, Sam, indeed, we are good old friends. I appreciate that comment. And I appreciate all the good things you said about CEBRA. That was fantastic. This is a project. This project has a large team, and you can see the list of people on the front page here. Two of which are going to help me out today. In fact, do most of the presentation, Edith Arndt and Tracey Hollings. CEBRA's been working with ACIAR now for a couple of years. We're in year 2 of this project, trying to look at how ACIAR contributes to the value of biosecurity generally in the region and in Australia. ACIAR is the Agricultural Centre for it's the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. One of its mandates is to provide research for better biosecurity and agricultural outcomes across the regions. Our focus is mostly on Southeast Asia, but ACIAR also works in Africa, East Asia, Pacific, and South Asia. And indeed, it's not just research that they're interested in, although that is its initial mandate. They're interested in practical outcomes. So all of these research methodologies, these tools are used in a practical setting to get better biosecurity outcomes and better agricultural outcomes generally. So it's a pleasure for us to be working with them, and it's been a wonderful ride so far. We're halfway through year 2 with some work to do. In terms of the design, year 1 of the project, our task was to put together a toolkit for ACIAR to evaluate their projects, their biosecurity projects, their expenditures in the region, using various methods, technical methods, benefit cost methods, all kinds of things that were done. And indeed, that's the year 1 sort of project, the toolkit for project evaluation. And Edith will take you through some part of that. It's actually a huge toolkit with a number of different facets and elements. Edith is only going to touch on some selected few of them, but I think you'll find that fascinating. Year 2, which we're halfway through, is to implement that project evaluation framework. How effective is ACIAR's expenditures on biosecurity in the region? Implement it with a series of case studies. And we started with mangoes in Davao in the Philippines, and that tells you why the mangoes are on the front slide. And we're also now starting to look at animal biosecurity, both in Indonesia and Timor-Leste. So Tracey will take you through some of that work as well. I think just a little bit of an overview, if you don't mind, team. I think there are three main benefits from this kind of work. First, ACIAR's research and its practical implementation of that research generates better biosecurity outcomes. And in fact, you can sort of test the various biosecurity measures in practice in various regional settings and see what works and what doesn't, what generates the best rate of return, which ones in fact just don't work. And in fact, rates of return for someone like me is especially important. So you're asking the question, how much should we spend? Where should we spend it? What kind of measure should we spend it on? And ACIAR is doing that through its practical application of this research. The second sort of main benefit, I think, from this sort of work we're doing and from ACIAR generally, is that it generates really better incomes, better developmental outcomes for countries in the region. Better incomes, better agricultural production, better food security. One of my first experiences with ACIAR was working indirectly with them, but still working with them in Vietnam, looking at how you could do better rice production in the Mekong and Red River Delta areas. It was back in the 90s. And indeed, that work that ACIAR helped do in combination with other things moved Vietnam from being barely able to feed its own population to now the second or third largest exporter of rice in the world. They have huge impact, ACIAR and other people as well who are working in those areas to get better developmental incomes. And that's why we're really happy to be working with them. It's really a good initiative, very effective, very good. The third key sort of benefit from this kind of work we're doing is that if you get better biosecurity outcomes in the region, you get less arrivals into Australia of pests and diseases. These are called pre-border measures, essentially. So that, in fact, again, less pests and diseases come to Australia. So that's really relevant. If you've seen the CEBRA value of biosecurity model, where we estimated the value of biosecurity at the border in terms of avoided losses, that dollar amount is 314 billion over 50 years. That's the savings, if you like, in terms of avoided losses that we generate as a result of border biosecurity. Adding to this layer is now the pre-border layer. So when you have measures in the region that have better biosecurity outcomes, you'll affect arrival rates. And I think it's, our value model, CEBRA value model, is sensitive, very sensitive to those sort of arrival rates. So all three taken together, I think, give us a really good feeling for the work we're doing with ACIAR and the contribution we're making to biosecurity for Australia, but also for the region. And that's I think that's what's good about it. All three of us will take questions at the end, but I'm going to turn over now to Edith and Tracey to talk about year one and year two. If that's okay, Edith, we'll start with you, sort of go through the year one project, and then we'll move to Tracey.
Yes. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Tom, and also thank you, Sam, for your introduction, and welcome everyone to this CEBRAnar. It's lovely to have you on board. So I'll skip to the next slide. So Tom has already talked about this, so I can straight go into ACIAR's objectives. So ACIAR's objectives are around improving food security, sustainability of production, human nutrition and health, improving gender equity, and building capacity in its partner countries. So ACIAR has got a long-standing tradition in impact assessment. They have always tried to evaluate the impact that their work has and whether they are achieving their intended objectives. Impact assessments are inherently difficult because of attribution. It can be difficult to attribute impacts that you observe to a particular cause. But impact evaluation is important to ACIAR because it helps them understand the value of its pre-border investment, like Tom pointed out, and the value of that work to Australia. So ACIAR commissioned CEBRA to develop a methodological framework, or as Tom called it, a toolkit, for estimating and aggregating the value add of ACIAR's biosecurity-related work. So CEBRA developed an evaluation framework in 2022, and that framework was based on a theory of change as a theoretical basis for the evaluation. And during that work, we identified 5 separate research themes. We have got them on here: vaccines, biological control, integrated pest management, new varieties, diagnostics, and surveillance. So we thought that these 5 themes represented ACIAR's biosecurity-related research portfolio, which is quite large because ACIAR started working in that space since the 1980s. So in the current project, we are working on 3 case studies that we are applying our evaluation framework to. So this slide gives you an overview of ACIAR's biosecurity research program. This diagram looks a little bit like a theory of change, but it isn't because the arrows are missing. When we developed our evaluation framework, we looked at the overall research portfolio, and we identified a few elements that are general to all of the programs and projects in that portfolio. So on the left here, we have the inputs that are generally needed to undertake the projects and programs. So we have got participants, researchers, government representatives, and so on. We've got financial resources and physical resources. And then again, here we have got the activities that I mentioned before. And the activities then lead to outputs. And these outputs here were categorized by Davis et al. In 2008 in an ACIAR report, which was called the Guidelines for Assessing the Impacts of ACIAR's Research Activities. That was an ACIAR report that was part of the impact assessment series that ACIAR has put out. And we can have a look through some of the outputs. So outputs of research can be new technologies, you can have new scientific knowledge, and also capacity building. And capacity building is a really important part of ACIAR's work with their partners in the other countries. And capacity building is usually integrated into all biosecurity projects. They're usually not standalone activities. So outputs lead to outcomes, and we have a few different ones listed here. And these are the outcomes that the biosecurity-related research has produced or produces. So we're looking at biosecurity outcomes that can be a reduced pest population or a reduction in disease spread, economic outcomes, so higher incomes or lower control costs, environmental outcomes. So what we see often is because of these project activities, the integrated pest management strategies, there will be less use of chemicals, which is definitely an advantage for environmental systems. And then there will be capacity building outcomes. And the impacts here on the right in black are what ACIAR wants to assess after the completion of their projects and programs. So these are the higher level changes that align with ACIAR's objectives. So again, here we have got food security, gender equity, community livelihood, things like that. So now I'm providing you with more detail on our evaluation framework, which is built around the requirements for impact evaluations. So in the first step, we would identify the production system and the threat that we want to look at. So is it a plant or an animal production system? So there could be a mango farm or a smallholder livestock system. And then what's the threat? Is it a plant pest or an animal disease? And the second step is to group related projects into a program. So ACIAR has often undertaken multiple projects in the same production system. So that's why we want to group related projects, because they all contribute to the same impacts. The third step is to develop a theory of change, and I will go straight into what that looks like. A theory of change basically describes how program interventions are intended to achieve a chain of outcomes, so how they are intended to work. There is a bit of ambiguity around terms in the evaluation space. Some people use the term theory of change or logic model or program theory, but these terms can be used interchangeably. And we have adopted the term theory of change because this is what ACIAR has been using over the years. So this theory of change diagram describes how project activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts are linked. We don't have the inputs listed here because there was not enough space on this diagram. But you can think back to the inputs that I talked about on a previous slide. So these general things like financial resources and people, of course. So we've got our activities listed here in these boxes, and then activities lead to outputs, and outputs are the direct and measurable results delivered by the program. You can often express them in terms of volumes or units, and we can look at some examples here. So this is a theory of change for the mangoes project that Tracey will talk about in a little bit. And we have got outputs like a map of the supply chain, or some IPM, like integrated pest management training materials. And you can see already that you can quantify some of these things really nicely, like the number of visits. You can have a number of workshops or a number of field days, things like that. So outputs can be easily quantified. And you can have other outputs like an integrated pest management strategy or strategies for pre and post-harvest management of diseases. So the adoption of outputs is a crucial element, because if nothing was adopted, we won't be able to see impacts, or in other words, we can't attribute the impacts that we observe to the program. So adopted outputs lead to outcomes over time. We have got them over here. And outcomes are the changes to the functioning of the program targets. So for example, agricultural production. And we can have a chain of outcomes. So you can categorize outcomes into short-term, mid-term, and long-term outcomes. And so, for example, we can look at an outcome here the reduced size of the pest population will then lead to another outcome or multiple outcomes: less damage to mango fruits, higher yield, and reduced control costs, for example. So the impacts are the intended or unintended changes at a broader level of organization. So we can look at regional communities, or we can work at national level. So these will be the high-level changes to food safety or income. And usually they are over a longer term. And the evaluator sort of defines then what impacts at what level, what time level that would work. And I would say for ACIAR projects, it would be between 5 and 10 years after completion of the projects. So a theory of change like that does not only describe how the project is supposed to work, but it also is good for communicating with, like a communication tool for your stakeholders, for your stakeholder engagement. And a theory of change or some sort of theoretical framework is needed in an evaluation, because otherwise, if we don't have a theory of change or a logic model, we risk that our evaluation outcomes are biased or actually not reflective of the performance of the program. So if we just go and think, oh, we take this indicator or that indicator, we actually might be selecting the wrong indicators or not enough of them. So it's really advisable to have some sort of a theoretical underlying framework for an evaluation. So going back to our evaluation framework, that was step 3. And step 4 is just to determine your geographical boundaries and your time frames. So this is at what level you want to evaluate. And number 5 is you define your control scenario, and that scenario actually reflects the activities that we have described in the theory of change, so our program activities. So for example, a control scenario could be the program tested and released a biological control agent into the area. So number 6 is define your counterfactual scenario. And this reflects the situation without the project activities. There are no interventions undertaken to mitigate a threat. And this is a really crucial step in impact evaluation, because otherwise you can't really attribute any impacts to your program activities. So number 7 is to collect data, and you can collect different types of data: spatial data, empirical or experimental data. So for example, experimental data could be on the effectiveness of hot water treatment in controlling post-harvest diseases in mangoes. So you can also collect spatial data on your assets. You can collect pest spread rates. You want to know about your outbreak size of a disease outbreak, and you collect economic data. In step number 8, you choose an appropriate modeling option. That could be a disease spread model or some economic financial analysis. So in terms of disease or pest spread model, there's always like simpler methods and more complex models on offer. And you would run both a control and a counterfactual scenario, and then you estimate the impacts on assets and calculate the benefits, which are the avoided damages. So depending on the project, you may also look at partial budgeting at farm level, or you use specific damage functions. So this really depends on the project that you're looking at and the availability of data. In step number 9, you want to bring the information together under a cost-benefit analysis, and you would discount your costs and your benefits to net present values. So about benefits, it can be difficult to quantify some types of benefits, usually social benefits. So you can use semi-quantitative or qualitative methods to do that. And so as part of our evaluation framework, we also proposed some ways how ACIAR could go about assessing the impacts of their programs on social benefits, such as food security. So research has long focused on food availability when talking about food security, but there's other elements to food security, which is food access, food utilization, and then the stability over time. So people would usually use the metric of production or yield for food availability. And we suggested 3 metrics for how we could estimate food access, because just because food is available doesn't mean that people can actually access the food. So they need to be physically able to get to the food and economically accessible and all these things. So we suggested 3 metrics: the food consumption expenditure, the food insecurity experience scale, and the household dietary diversity score. So the middle one here is you ask individuals or households and you ask them different yes or no questions. And the HDDS is a standardized questionnaire which you can give to households or to individuals. And you look at the food consumption, the quality and the quantity of 12 food groups over the past 24 hours in these questionnaires. So food utilization is a bit more difficult to measure because you need anthropometric measurements. So this is about assessing an individual's nutritional status. So you would need height and weight information and usually the mid-upper arm circumference. So that's a bit more difficult to do. So with any kinds of metrics like these, it's best to use or to apply a before and after control impact approach. But that is often not possible if you do an evaluation after the completion of the program, because you would often not have a baseline survey or the people wouldn't have set up a control group. So we also provided some advice on how the impacts of program interventions on gender equity and capacity building could be evaluated, but I won't go into detail about this in today's presentation. So I'll just move on how we have selected the programs that we are evaluating at the moment in our second ACIAR project. So we were looking for a representation across research themes. So we didn't want to have all of our projects just about vaccines or new varieties. And we also wanted to have a clear element of capacity building in those programs that we want to evaluate, because that's really an important part of ACIAR's work with their partner countries. We wanted a representation across different production systems and threats. So we're not always looking at just plant pests or just at animal diseases. We wanted to have a variety there. And our projects or programs that we wanted to evaluate should also be representative across ACIAR objectives. We were looking at programs that were completed more than 5 years ago, so we actually will be able to determine any impacts, to observe any impacts. So they had a completion date then between 2010 and 2018. And we were looking at programs with a larger budget, so beyond 1 million Australian dollars. And we were looking for programs that would have some information about whether project outcomes were adopted. And then we also looked at programs that had some material, like important material available, for example, final reports, impact assessments, and ideally also adoption studies. So in the current ACIAR project, we have got 3 case studies, and we have already evaluated an integrated pest management and supply chain improvement project in the Philippines and Australia on mangoes. The other projects are about livestock diseases, classical swine fever, and highly pathogenic avian influenza in eastern Indonesia and eastern Australia. And the last one is about policies for animal movements and biosecurity practices at live poultry markets in Indonesia. And with this, I finish my presentation and I will hand over to Tracey, who will tell you more about our first case study, the mangoes case study. So I will stop sharing.
Great. Is that showing? All right.
Yeah,
Cool.
all good.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Edith. So I'm just going to talk you through the case studies that we're working on. The first one, as Edith mentioned, is on mangoes. So this is really looking at insect pests and fungal diseases which cause significant fruit loss, reduce quality of fruit, and also inhibit access to key export markets such as China. So the key objectives of the project were to improve mango quality, size and yields by developing IPM solutions in the Philippines and Australia, and also improving fruit quality pre and post harvest through management of fungal disease controls and supply chain improvements. So IPM was implemented through bagging and pruning, pest monitoring, etc. And this was compared with current farmer practice as the counterfactual. And the second component of the project was looking at where and why production quality is lost from the farm gate to retail. So mangoes in the Philippines are really important. They're the third major food crop and valued at Australian $870 million in 2022. But yields are continuing to decline and costs such as pesticides keep increasing. So pests are the primary cause of yield loss and can be up to 40% yield loss. So 5 major mango pests were identified through the project and 2 post-harvest fungal diseases. So the current farmer practice at the time of the study was to have 13 spraying cycles per year, and these were done at regular intervals rather than on a needs basis. So there were 7 trial orchards in the southern Philippines at Davao del Sur and Davao del Norte. And as part of the project, farmer clusters were also established to help disseminate information through farmers and knowledge generation and also support for farmers. So as Edith pointed out, this is a theory of change for the mangoes. A lot of the impact assessment is focused on the outcomes and impacts in the dashed box, particularly economic, environmental and social impacts. So at the farm level, some of the economic impacts, we firstly looked at the benefit cost ratio, which is the total benefit divided by the total cost. And a value of 1 represents the break-even point where costs and benefits are equal. So as you can see, IPM is high for all farms. And it's interesting that it may be a greater benefit when yields are low, which may allow farmers to endure adverse years with reduced losses. We also looked at avoided damages, which are yield losses that would have occurred without the mitigation measures being assessed. Orchards in Davao del Sur and had lower damages, net incomes and production costs in Davao del Norte, and this is mostly related to climate. And so the avoided damages ranged between all the farms from 50 to 2,000 Australian dollars per hectare. So we did some regional analysis over time, and we looked at 3 scenarios for IPM adoption rates, high, medium and low, for the 14 years since the completion of the project. And we used a logistic growth, which kind of better represents adoption rates. So the vertical lines on the plot indicate the duration of the project, and the red line is the income data that we got from the Philippine Statistics Authority for the Davao region. The green lines represent the income that would have occurred if no IPM had been introduced. So the grey region is what we're really interested in, as it represents the additional income that would have occurred under the given adoption scenario. So after speaking with some in-country contacts, the low uptake is likely the most realistic scenario. And this was mostly attributed to a lack of cash capital from farmers, so that's a big issue. So a lot of the IPM strategies that were implemented, such as bagging and pruning, often require an immediate cash outlay, which can be prohibitive for farmers. but they also receive a lot of their advice from chemical resellers. So we also did the same scenarios for production costs and yields, and the outcomes of those was even at a low uptake of IPM of 10% in the 14 years, there was a cost saving of $6 million in production costs and a cumulative additional yield of more than 13,000 metric tonnes. So there's also the supply chain management component, and conservative numbers in the report suggest that at harvest, 40% of mangoes are export quality. But through the process of the mangoes moving through biostations and arriving at export warehouses, 28% further loss of mangoes are rejected, which equates to about a lost value of around $290 per tonne. So the project looked at different ways of managing supply chain improvements and also testing things like hot water treatments to reduce the effect of fungal diseases. So some of the other impacts to social and environment, capacity building was a pretty big component of the project. There was various workshops and training provided, and also demonstrations at field schools and field days. 11 clusters were formed, which encompassed 46 mango farmers, and these clusters were each linked with experts to encourage cooperation, knowledge sharing, and reduce farmer isolation. There was also significant health and environmental impacts. So IPM has half the number of spraying cycles and a reduced volume from current farmer practice. So this obviously has significant benefits for reduced exposure of chemicals to farm workers and also food safety for consumers with less chemical residue on the mangoes themselves. It also reduces environmental and water contamination and spray drift, and the occurrence of natural biological control agents almost doubled with IPM first farmer practice. We also developed some pest pressure maps using some HDMs for some of the pests that we produced using biosecurity commons. And so this is kind of gives an indication of where IPM would have the greatest impacts if it was implemented, and that's the yellow regions in the map. So another component of the project was looking at mangoes in Australia. The priority here was on fruit spotting bugs, which were perceived at the time as a minor pest by growers, but significant damage has been recorded in other crops such as lychees, where I think yields of declines of 98% have been recorded. So the way farmers often deal with that is successful pesticide applications via canopy spraying at the whole of farm level. So pilot studies were undertaken in northern Queensland to look at fruit spotting bug population dynamics and more targeted application of pesticides. So there were some fairly large economic impacts for controlling fruit spotting bug. So avoided damages in infested areas range between 86 and 158 per tree, which can equate to up to $18,000 per infested hectare, noting that the project also demonstrated hotspot behaviour, so the benefits are not uniformly distributed across the orchards. And there's also a seasonal variation element in the fruit spotting bug populations, but it's now recognised as a major pest of mangoes. So part of the project also looked at moving away from broad spectrum pesticides applied at the orchard level, so for more of a hotspot application, which reduces the amount of chemicals. This is also particularly important because half of Queensland mango crops are grown in the Great Barrier Reef catchment, and some of the pesticides that were being used were highly toxic to aquatic species. So this has benefits to non-target species. So ACIAR has got an interest in the value of its research investments for pre-border biosecurity, as Tom mentioned before. So this project helped with some of the knowledge acquisition and readiness planning for some of pests and distributions and ecology. Also some of the potential damage that some of the pests might incur if they arrive in Australia, and some of the effective control measures that might be implemented. And of particular note was ceased fly, which is also called midge, I think, in particular. So that's had a major range expansion since 2010, right through the Philippines and now into Torres Strait. So our second study is looking at livestock movements. These are currently in progress, so I don't have a huge amount of quantitative results to share, but just to cover off the project, it's about identifying livestock trade patterns that are high risk for disease transmission, specifically HPAI and CSF, and looking at both legal and illegal movements. So it supports the development of policy to restrict, manage and monitor livestock movements in Indonesia and NTT. It also looked at pilot studies to improve biosecurity practices at live animal markets, and also using spread modelling and social network analysis. It also had an Australia component looking at informal pig movements, particularly in smallholders, farms, looking at on-farm biosecurity practices, and also did some risk modelling of FMD and CSF introduction and spread. So again, we've got a theory of change that we've developed for each of the project components. So we've got the classical swine fever, HPAI, and also the Australian component. And we're focusing at looking on the economic, environment, and social impacts. So just an overview of the CSF component. After surveys of farmers through the project, 91% didn't know what CSF was, and they really reported sick or dead pigs. And there's also few biosecurity practices were observed at the live animal market. So the main districts of the case studies was in NTT, with also some in Timor-Leste. Farmer surveys were conducted to increase scientific knowledge of pig population demographics, movements between villages and markets. And there's also some seroprevalence surveys to determine disease prevalence and the efficacy of vaccine control programs. So we're planning on evaluating some of the vaccine control programs and impacts on population outcomes using some scenario analysis. We're also going to look at the pig movements in Australia. So some of this was the first work done on comparative assessment of transboundary animal diseases and risk. Some of their recommendations were looking at increasing education and knowledge of pig farmers and smallholders, and also highlighted the value of tracing pig movements. So we might look at using Edith, which is the Australian Animal Disease Model, to look at assessing the risk of FMD spread under different scenarios and under their recommendations. So such as time to detection, so increasing smallholder education and knowledge can reduce the time to detection and the number of farmers reporting, and also looking at movement tracing and how effective that is. So the benefit to Australia is through controlling CSF and HPAI in Indonesia, which is a priority to widen the disease-free buffer, and also some of the preparedness work that's been done in Australia. So case study number 3 is looking at a non-industrial commercial poultry sector in Indonesia. We haven't started this project as of yet, so really it's just an outline of what the project's about, which is to define and implement cost-effective biosecurity measures for the sector and improve biosecurity and economic viability. And this had a focus on HPAI. It also aimed to facilitate the adoption of biosecurity measures and integrate these into the industry association structures, which helps with adoption rates. And the idea is also to have sustainable economic incentives for smallholder farmers, rather than having one-off payments, making it sustainable so it can for long term. And part of this was consumers' willingness to pay more for certified clean market products. So some of the difficulties we had came across as part of the impact evaluation was scaling up small pilot studies to assess larger impacts. And this is particularly the case across large temporal and spatial scales without using a lot of assumptions. It's also problematic obtaining some of the relevant data at the scales that we require, and this is particularly in developing countries. It can also, we found it difficult to contact a lot of the researchers. Some of them had moved on. So this, the Mango project in particular was 14 years post completion. So This has some implications for establishing the context of the project and also understanding the current situation. An example of this was speaking with in-country contacts. We were able to get some of the ideas about why adoption rates were low in the Philippines. So that's all from me. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to talk through it. I think all the members of the team are online, so.
All right, good, thanks. Thanks, Tracey, thanks, Edith. Sam, if I can just add a word before I turn it back to you, that would be great. I should note that, I mean, we're quite happy with the theory of change and how it's used for project evaluation, but if you have any comments after the meeting today, please send them through by email. I should also note that we're working on a similar kind of project for DAF. Different case studies focusing principally on animal disease, but trying to assess again the value of pre-border biosecurity. So quite excited about moving into the pre-border space because not many people are doing that, and we're taking a good crack at it. Again, thanks to Tracey and Edith and the entire team. It's a large team working on this project, and I think they're all online, so good on them. Back to you, Sam.
Thanks, Tom, Edith, Tracey. If anyone has any questions, feel free to either pop it in the chat or put your hands up. For me, it's super interesting. You know, I'm one of those people that gets really excited hearing about this type of stuff, and my mind's moving at 100 miles an hour thinking, oh, how is that translatable? How can it relate to things that we're doing here or there? But I was going to ask about, it's kind of touched on, but really to take it home and make it clear what difficulties you had in the project quantifying the avoided losses part of it, and how you convince the project partners of the value of that work. Because, you know, it's like one of 100 things coming across people's desks every day. How do you get it up there with the things that people pay attention to? And then, you know, the avoided losses part is just my own personal interest subject matter. So I just wondered what your views were on that as well.
Tracey, you want to take a crack at that?
So the avoided damages, so scaling up that was a bit difficult. So we really just based it on the data that was provided in the project. Otherwise, there was going to be too many assumptions on some of that. And the second part was
how you convince the project partners of the value of the work and get them to kind of the buy-in to getting it done.
Yeah, they're generally fairly happy to do that, Sam, with contacts through ACIAR. And also locally, I mean, the Mangoes project is a good example of how you can use this information to, I'm actually in far north Queensland at the moment with respect to the traditional owners up here. You can use that information to do better in terms of mango production, for example, up here in far north Queensland. It's like a testing ground for different kinds of biosecurity measures. And in fact, you know, the returns there were really quite large. I mean, they surprised me. You know, Filipinos are better off adopting these sorts of procedures. But you'd be surprised. I mean, people both in host countries and here in Australia are quite keen to hear the results. And it's easy for them to engage. Let's put it that way.
Maybe to your point, you know, when there's a reputation of excellence, both between CEBRA and ACIAR, it's a bit easy to bring people into the tent on it up front. But obviously, when you get to the end of the project, then and you're able to throw around the ROI, the return on investment numbers and the value of it, the change, then that's easy because everyone knows what's good for them when they get to that point.
Yeah, so we're going to act to try and sort of socialize some of this material and communicate it more broadly when we're finished. It's only year 2 of the project, but I think that's really important for us. We care about the impact, and so that people, in fact, can see what's going on in these areas. Yeah. And the DAF project will do that too, of course, especially so perhaps for animal disease.
I might add something to that, Tom. It's
Great.
I think once you have done these evaluations and you have got some really good messages to the stakeholders, and they can then maybe change how they set up projects for the next time, like future projects, and really can use the results to make some changes. I think that's when kind of the value of impact assessments or impact evaluation really comes through. It's kind of it builds, and then once you have got this positive feedback loop and successful translation into policies or changes, then maybe the value increases for stakeholders of doing impact assessments. It just needs to build over time, I think, the story around the evaluation.
Kind of like a positive snowballing effect.
Yes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It takes time for these measures to be observed. And in fact, as I think Tracey or Edith said, it's up to 10 years. I mean, that is one of the challenges, because these projects that we're evaluating have been going on for some period of time, and people come and go. But we've managed to get around that.
Mm.
Is there any other questions from anyone in the group? Don't be shy, but no obligation. Yes, Ian, please.
One of the challenges that I've seen with ACIAR projects is that often, and you mentioned this, but when they're done 20, maybe 30 years ago, when we collect a lot of the information, we never think about measuring social benefit. And your table that you had was fantastic if we were doing a project today. But the challenge I see is how you measure all those significant benefits, particularly on social benefits, gender equity, now when these projects are done 10, 20 years ago. So I think that's one of the huge challenges, that if we were doing these projects today, we would collect a lot more information. Heaven forbid we might even need more economists in the team. But yeah, so yeah, there are some interesting, great presentation, and that table on social benefits was, I think, extremely important, because that is where I see the benefits in a lot of these smallholder farmers.
Right. Thanks for that, Ian. I mean, the real benefit of year one of the project was just putting this template together, this theory of change template for project evaluation together. And indeed, as I said, we're quite happy with that. But yeah, trying to measure everything is a challenge. It's a work in progress. I see my old friend Danny Spring has his hand up.
Hi, Tom. Hi, everybody. Hi, Edith. Hi, Tracey.
Hi, Dan.
I'm very affected by a virus, so I'm not sure if my head's working well enough to not to embarrass myself with a question, but I'll ask it anyway. When you're looking at the impact of IPM extension across Asia, when you're operating in villages with really low incomes, I was wondering whether any people are actually not using chemical pesticides because they don't have the cash for it. That was the first question, in which case this sort of project could actually increase pesticide use. But on the other hand, if pesticides are very cheap compared to what they're selling their mangoes for, they may be overusing pesticides, in which case you could reduce it. And so my second question is, to get a sustainable reduction in chemical pesticide use, did you demonstrate to the villagers that they could save a lot of money by switching to IPM? Because unless they're saving a lot of money, I don't see them continuing with IPM practices.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's it.
So I think the way it's set up in the Philippines is that the chemical sellers provide them with essentially a loan. So they don't actually have to pay off the chemicals until the mangoes are harvested. So in that respect, that doesn't require that cash outlay like some of the IPM strategies do, which is prohibitive for a lot of farmers. So yeah, and I guess they get a lot of their advice from the chemical sellers because they come around a lot. So there's that kind of influence there. But there was significant cost savings of implementing IPM and saving on pesticides, because pesticides are one of the biggest costs, and they've been increasing, one of the most increasing costs as well.
Thank you very much. So it sounds like you're in a battle. We're in a battle with the merchants of chemical pesticides to try and limit the use of chemical pesticides. Anyway, thank you very much.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Thanks, Danny. Is there any other questions or comments even? It doesn't necessarily need to be a question, I suppose.
It is. I have to agree with Ian. We need more economists on these project evaluations. That's exactly right. Thank you for that, Ian. And good question too from both of you, Danny as well.
All right. Is there Tom, Edith, or Tracey? Do any of you have any final comments you want to make?
Yeah. Well, I think. Yeah, Edith, Tracey.
No, sorry, I just want to say I'm good, thank you.
Yeah.
So I always have a final comment. I mean, this is still work in progress. So keep an eye out for what's coming. These reports will go online, and you can scrutinize them at your leisure and given your interest. Also, keep in mind the work that we're going to be doing with DAF on animal disease pre-border, because that's, I think, pretty exciting as well. So we'll come back, I hope, if you don't mind, Sam, and do another CEBRAnar on that work with DAF on pre-border measures. I think that would be good.
Yeah, that sounds great. And no, we don't mind at all. We're very grateful for it, in fact. And if anyone kind of has their mind open to that DAF work, I might encourage you, when the materials do go online for this work, to go and run your eyes over it, because I think there's kind of a relationship piece there that familiarizing and understanding this might better place you to understand the DAF stuff too. But I've got a reputation for keeping these things on time, and I'm very pleased to live up to said reputation again. So in closing today up, then I will just thank you to our illustrious panel, presenters, I should say, for coming and talking us through the project, making it relevant to the work that we do and interesting to us as well. And also thank you to those that have taken time out of their day to come along and hear about the work too. In isolation, it's a piece of information, but I personally think the value in these types of sessions are in sharing the understanding of the breadth of things that are going on, so we can make linkages between different bodies of work. And so even if one link is made out of this presentation, I think it's time well spent. Our next CEBRAnar is going to be held on Thursday, the 26th of September at 11 a.m. again, and it will feature on the topic of Tasmanian border biosecurity, the efficacy and value of at-border interventions. So I hope to see many of you then. And again, thank you to Tom, Edith, and Tracey for your generosity of time in presenting today.
Yeah, thanks to you, Sam, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. That was great.